Unsafe abortion has a long history. This is what abortion looked like 3,000 years ago in ancient Cambodia. This is abortion in medieval Europe. This is 20th century Japan and 1920s Russia. Unsafe abortion should be ancient history, but sadly it's still a real problem today. Around 25 million unsafe abortions occur worldwide every year. Of these, around 7 million will result in either injury or death.
Safe abortion services need to be provided, because if they are not provided, then women are taking the matter into their own hands. They go to local providers, they do it themselves, and this is what also underlies the statistics on maternal mortality.
The World Health Organization estimates that unsafe abortions account for 13% of maternal deaths worldwide.
We already have a public health sector that's unwilling to provide safe abortions, so we have many women and girls who don't have the resources being pushed into unsafe abortions.
The best way to reduce unsafe abortion is to expand the available legal grounds for abortion and to make legal abortion safely accessible to all. This has repeatedly been shown to drastically reduce maternal mortality and morbidity. There are a range of human rights engaged by access to safe abortion: life, health, gender equality, privacy, autonomy, and dignity. Different human rights framings can be effective in different contexts. This episode examines how to strategically employ human rights in advocating for legal and safe access to abortion.
In the early 1990s in South Africa, with the coming into being of the new constitution and entrenched constitutional rights, we knew that it would be an important time to bring in place abortion law reform and to shift from a restrictive legal regime to a progressive legal regime that institutionalized abortion on request. So the most important argument for us in South Africa was probably the public health argument, which is that women's lives and health were being put at risk by going to the back streets. A feminist health researcher tried to count the number of women who were dying through going through backstreet abortions, and she came up with a figure of 425 women a year die, and another number of women are suffering serious health risks. And that became key in the arguments, because we could say this is very much about public health. And public health, we know, is the strongest argument. It's not necessarily the best argument for women, because you want to argue that this is about women's autonomy and women's choice, not to save women's lives. So I always have a problem with putting public health arguments first, but it's a good strategic choice.
The first step was to choose whether to go through Parliament or through the courts.
We thought very carefully about the forum where we wanted change to take place, and we knew that that shouldn't be the courts, that the courts coming out of apartheid were dominated by men, and we worried about the conservative aspect. Even the new constitutional court was untested, and we were worried about. The new parliament had 25% women, and these were women that we'd worked with in the early 1990s who were our allies and our colleagues, and we trusted that Parliament would be a place that we could push for abortion law reform. Where we thought cases were coming to court, we actively tried to keep them away from courts.
With this decided, Kathy and the other advocates used 6 strategies to try to get a new abortion law passed in Parliament.
First, we formed an alliance. We called it the Reproductive Rights Alliance, and the point of that was to bring together women and organisations working on human rights, working on the law, and working on health, so that we could strategise together and that we could also allocate different ideas and different strategies to different groups. The second thing was that we had to get the science and the research right. So we needed to bring the evidence in order to prove that abortion was necessary for public health reasons. Thirdly, we had to get the rights arguments in place. So we also had to be able to take the rights that were in the Constitution and to give content to them in terms of abortion. So what did it mean for abortion in terms of equality and non-discrimination? The fact that a restrictive law would discriminate against poor black women because indirectly those women were not able to access abortion under the old regime. Fourthly, we had to work on strategies in Parliament, so we actually helped write speeches. We had to access women in Parliament to be able to help them argue the matter in Parliament. Fifthly, and actually this is pre the parliamentary process, we engaged in the strategy of actually writing a law in the first place, so getting the substantive draft in place that we could then take to government so that it would make it easier and quicker for them to take it through Parliament. And finally, we had to work out who our allies were going to be in civil society, and most important amongst those allies was the religious lobby. We made an effort to talk to religious organisations that were sympathetic across the diversity of religions in South Africa. So we wanted to show that this was not something that was anti-religion, but that women could make their own choices in their own consciousness and in conversation with their own God, if you like.
One problem they faced was the possibility of a conscience vote in Parliament.
So we had to work very hard with the African National Congress, which was the majority party in Parliament, to persuade them that they could not allow a conscience vote, because we needed the majority of that party to be able to pass the law through Parliament. And we were successful in that. And we argued that on the basis that this is about people's individual choice, that it's fine to have your conscience, but by acting in accordance with your conscience on this issue, you're denying other people rights that they should have. And it worked because it was supported by some religious leaders. The head of the Methodist Church wrote an article in the Sunday newspapers a couple of weeks before it was decided about why it was important that there wasn't in this instance a conscience vote. So that was a very important ally in that struggle.
When the issue came to a vote in Parliament in 1995, their strategies paid off.
We got the law in place, the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act. It was regarded at the time as one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in the world. It allowed women to access abortion on request for the first 12 weeks of pregnancy, and then under certain specified conditions for the second 12 weeks.
But soon after this victory, they had to defend their progress against the movement of the anti-abortion lobby.
So an organisation called the Christian Lawyers Association was already planning a constitutional challenge. So within months they launched papers saying that abortion is unconstitutional because it violates the right to life of the fetus. So it was an absolutist ideological challenge. It completely challenged the underpinnings of the Act. It was a do or die zero-sum game. If they won, the whole law would have been struck down. If they lost everything. And of course they lost, because we have a constitution that is very explicit on a number of rights. It's explicit on the right to equality, it's explicit on the right to freedom and security of the person, which includes the right to reproductive decision making and the right to bodily integrity. So that was certainly on our side. We also have a common law that includes something called the NASCITURUS rule, which is that rights do not vest until you're born. So rights do not vest in fetuses. So we were able to push that away quite quickly, which was an important victory. The lawyers at that stage handed over to some extent to the health workers, and really the health activists then worked with government health workers to get implementation ready. They worked a lot with midwives and nurses on programs called values clarification, which were to try and get midwives and health workers to understand why women's right to choose was important. And it was very successful in the first 5 years or so. The research that was done showed that maternal mortality and morbidity reduced drastically. So on that measure alone, it was a huge success.
We are in a crucial political situation that we have to find ways to accommodate different views and accommodate different values. We are in a very polarized moment that people don't even talk to each other in Brazil. And I think we should develop ways to talk.
In Brazil, there is a Supreme Court case pending on the decriminalization of abortion. Marta argues that creating strong dialogue amongst all stakeholders was essential in moving this case forward.
We had a public hearing on the constitutional case, and it was a landmark in the discourse of abortion, because what they were saying is that it's not that your views doesn't have to be respected, it's not that the fetus has no value, but we have to find ways to protect it in a way that is consistent with women's rights. So criminalization is not a good option. It harms women and it's not efficient to protect the fetus. And there are positive measures that we can advance that protects women and also protects the fetus. This was a successful, important discourse. When we expose the consequences, it makes the conversation easier. So what are the consequences? In fact, criminalization doesn't prevent abortion, but puts women in a specific group of women in a very bad situation.
Before bringing this case, advocates in Brazil had been making important incremental progress in the courts. These cases laid the groundwork for the decriminalization case.
One was on stem cell research because it was questioned in the basis of protection of the fetus, protection of life since conception. IVF proceedings were questioned, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was legal, it was constitutional, and it was very important for the abortion field because they said the protection of life is not absolute. The protection of life is incremental, and we protect more the biographical life than the biological life. So that was the first step our Supreme Court gave towards interpretation that favors women. And the second one, that was the anencephalic fetus case. So the claim was very modest. The claim was that an anencephalic pregnancy coming to an end is not an abortion. The overall ruling was very interesting. For the first time, they recognized that health is not only physical, but it's also mental and social health. I think it's a small step, but an important one.
Compared to policy change, court rulings are harder to gain, but they can also be much harder to overturn, so they become a firm footing on which to depend in times of political change.
We had a strong political shift in Brazil, and in the moment that we faced this political shift, we recognized how important it was to have specific interpretation of rights recognized by the Supreme Court, to put some limits to what can happen in the future.
Even where there is good legislation in place, women are often still unable to access safe abortion services. The courts are therefore also an important forum in which to address the problems of implementation. A recent case in Mexico has done exactly this. It concerned a woman named Margarita.
During her pregnancy, she realized that her health was at risk. In Mexico, there are different indications for abortion. In Mexico City, it is legal up to 12 weeks, but in other states of the country, the legislation varies. She tried to access the service and she was denied this. And so her case was filed by Gire and it went to different instances until it reached the Supreme Court. And what the court ruled, which I think will become very important in the future in Mexico for the human rights discussion, particularly related to reproductive rights, was that access to abortion in cases of health risks was part of the human right to health, which is protected in our Constitution. So this is very relevant ruling, not only for Margarita in particular and for her family, but it does establish a very important precedent in general for all women in Mexico.
A similar case has recently gone through the Kenyan courts. In Kenya, abortion is legal under a range of circumstances, including when the pregnancy poses a danger to the life or health of the woman. However, in practice, only private health facilities are currently offering abortion services.
Public health facilities don't provide access to safe abortion, but they do provide access to post-abortion care. So usually the practice is, if you do it outside of the realm of the law, they'll help you fix it, but only if you start it yourself.
The government did begin the process of training public health providers to offer legal abortion services by using a set of standards and guidelines on abortion care, but the guidelines were unexpectedly withdrawn in 2015.
The Ministry of Health, after a lengthy process of development of the guidelines and then also civil society and other stakeholder participation, decided to withdraw the guidelines almost overnight. They issued a circular stating that medical practitioners could not undergo training on safe abortion services or comprehensive abortion care. They were affecting access to reproductive health services for women and girls, and they were just putting a caveat on who could do it, and this only impacts on people who cannot have access in private facilities. And that was really the crux of the case.
The Centre for Reproductive Rights in Kenya brought a case to challenge the withdrawal of the standards and guidelines, and they framed the case around a particular individual. She is known as J.M.M.
So the story is about J.M.M, who was 14 when she was raped, and then she became pregnant as a result of that rape. She decided to terminate the pregnancy with her mother, and they couldn't afford to go to a private facility. So she went to a quack. And then she got an unsafe abortion, which resulted in significant damage to her body. So then J.M.M became the face of the case because of what she had gone through, having to procure an unsafe abortion because she couldn't access a safe one after being raped. And she passed away in 2018 because there was kidney failure that resulted from her unsafe abortion.
In June 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that J.M.M's rights had been violated because the government had withdrawn the standards and guidelines that would have allowed her to access an abortion in a public health facility. The court reinstated the guidelines, and it also explicitly clarified that rape is one of the conditions under which abortion is legal in Kenya.
So we're hoping this gives us the grounding to start obliging the government to meet its obligation as the state to have safe abortion services within every public health facility. But we would be wary to bring a case into criminalization of abortion because we don't quite have the bench at the time or the country at this stage to agree that women should be allowed to access reproductive health and rights when and so they choose. We're not there yet. A push at this stage to have it decriminalized, I believe, would backfire on us. We have this incremental gain. Let's see how much you can leverage policy changes using this gain and perhaps push a country towards being more tolerant of allowing, not even of allowing women, of accepting that women should have choices around their bodies that do not involve other people.
So we won in Parliament and we won in the courts. We didn't win so much in the public hospitals because what started to really happen was, I think the political courage to push it through began to diminish. Health ministers changed. We had 2 feminist health ministers back to back and then a not so feminist health minister. I think the political will to really drive implementation, to designate hospitals to carry out abortion were difficult. I think health workers who carried out abortions began to be stigmatized for doing so and were subject to judgment not only in hospitals but in their communities, and began to feel quite alone in what was becoming quite a hostile environment of conscientious objection. And so there was a very quiet pushback. And slowly we began to see fewer and fewer health workers willing to do that work and designated facilities beginning to decline. In particular, in the second trimester, we saw the decline. So despite the fact of having a progressive law in place, these other challenges arose.
Poland faces similar challenges. Even though abortion is legal in many circumstances, including in cases of rape, when a woman's life or any form of health is in jeopardy, or in the case of fatal fetal abnormality, women in Poland often still find themselves completely unable to access abortion services.
Very important part of our work is to secure that those conditions of legal abortions which are in the law are being fully accessible to women. We had a number of cases when women were entitled to legal abortion on in very obvious situations. Like, for example, it was a very famous case of a woman. The fetus is so badly deformed that it's not able to survive. Nevertheless, she was forced by the director of the hospital to carry on the pregnancy till term. The fetus died 1 week after she delivered, and was a terrible personal tragedy. This director of this hospital has been dismissed. Nevertheless, this discussion around the rights of doctors to object to abortion led to some negative legal developments, because according to the legislation in Poland, doctors had an obligation to refer a woman so that she could go to another doctor who doesn't object, because she has also rights to services. However, that case led the medical chamber to go to the Constitutional Court in Poland to check whether this demand of referral is in agreement with constitutional rights of doctors or not. And unfortunately, the Polish Constitutional Court found that they don't have to refer. So now women are even in a worse situation because the rights of doctors, according to the Polish Constitutional Court, are superior to women's rights to services. So unfortunately.
In South Africa, advocates are tackling this issue by creating regulations around conscientious objection.
The idea is to put in place a requirement of application and registration, so that if you want to conscientiously object, you have to apply to do so and you have to set out the reasons. And then you would only be able to do so in certain circumstances. And that would largely be regulated by medical ethics. And there's certain categories of worker who absolutely can't conscientiously object. A cleaner or a receptionist or somebody serving food can't conscientiously object. So none of that was regulated. Now by regulating it, they're able to really control who's in the reproductive health care clinics and who's providing the service.
It's also important to think about the language that's being used to describe these situations.
So increasingly health workers don't talk about conscientious objection, they talk about barriers to access. And it's a conscious attempt to shift the language, is to say this is not about the thinking of the individual health worker, it's about access for the woman. So let's call it what it is. It's a barrier to women's access. And how do we treat a barrier to access? And I think it's a wonderful political shift.
But in the end, the greatest tool for advocates is not necessarily law or policy, but people. In order to succeed, the movement for abortion rights must be rooted in community mobilization.
When the Conservatives started to move these very regressive bills in constitutional amendments to protect the fetus, the feminist movement went to the streets. That was in 2015. That was a very important moment in Brazil. We called that the feminist spring.
In 2020, abortion rights in Poland made international headlines, but Polish women have a long history of using human rights to ensure legal access. When a complete ban on abortion was proposed in 2016, mobilization proved crucial.
Fundamentalist groups proposed a full ban on abortion. The great mobilization of the women's movement took place, and it was unprecedented mobilization of women on the ground from all parts of Poland. They just decided they have to do something. So we've organized a huge protest on the October the 3rd, 2016. Thousands of women went out to the streets, and actually it turned out that the running party, which was ready to restrict abortion, withdrew. Nevertheless, they tried on a couple of occasions later on, and all the time women were mobilized, not only in Warsaw, but also in other parts of Poland. And we've been able to get mobilized very quickly using social media, which turned out to be a very efficient tool to call for action. And it was really impressive. Something very new in our political climate and in our women's rights movement. What the running party was trying to do, to introduce quick changes like, in 3 days, hoping that we won't be able to mobilize in such a short notice. But it turned out that every time when trying to introduce some changes dangerous for women, women were able to get mobilized, to be visible, to claim that they are against, and the ruling party so far withdrew.
Wanda and her organisation have also been using international human rights instruments, reporting to the UN on how the Polish government is failing to live up to its human rights obligations.
We've submitted reports to CEDAW committee, to the Committee on Human Rights, to the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, to Committee on Children's Rights, and many others. And we always had very good recommendations. We also were working with special rapporteurs on health who visited Poland and also prepared their own reports on the situation in Poland regarding reproductive rights. I could say we are champions in using human rights instruments, but the weak part of it, it's the government. They always believed that they don't have to comply with those recommendations of human rights committees. Nevertheless, for us it is a very good educational tool for the society, because in the beginning, in 1993, very few people had an understanding of human rights dimensions of reproductive rights, of women's rights. But this educational process led to those massive protests in the streets now, because those women who went in the streets, they are very well aware of their rights, of what they expect from the government. So even if these mechanisms don't work that successfully as an educational tool for the society, as an awareness-raising mechanism, it's really very important. There have been a lot of teenage girls who participated in those protests, using all kinds of signals that they are pro-choice and they are engaged and they care. Women are going to be a driving force for progress and change in building the future of our planet and of our countries.
There's still a lot of work to be done to realise the right to life, health, gender equality, privacy, autonomy and dignity. But by working together and learning from each other, progress can be made towards a world where nobody is forced into the dangers of an unsafe abortion.